Let's bring in the panel now, and because of the coronavirus, we do everything remotely now. Also, we're spread all over the place. I'm a lonely guy here on a big desk. Let's bring in Rebecca Weiser, who's a contributor to The Spectator magazine, who joins us from News Corp headquarters in Sydney. Thanks for joining us, Rebecca. We've also got the former editor-in-chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell, via Skype, and the opinion editor at The Daily Telegraph, and, of course, host of Outsiders, James Morrow, joining us via Skype as well. Thanks all of you for joining us. I want to kick off with you, Chris, because you wrote about media coverage of the coronavirus in the Australian's media section today, and you were quite critical of how some of the media were approaching it. Give us your summary of the challenges here and how we all need to do better.
Well, I think your editorial at the start sort of nailed it, really. I called a bit in my piece for some humility on the part of journalists, and also, I guess, some understanding that politicians haven't done this before. There's no roadmap for how to handle this crisis. So not everything needs to happen today, and not every artificial difference that you can quote is worth quoting. And I think, as you said, readers and viewers get quite annoyed by this approach.
Yeah, but there's a balance to be struck, isn't there? Because, of course, there's got to be some scrutiny on government. And, for instance, the seemingly inexplicable way 2,500 people came off a cruise ship in Sydney, we've got to say how the state and federal governments made that happen. But there's a difference between that and sort of tricky point scoring, isn't there?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I thought Simon Benson was right in The Australian this morning to talk about the extent to which that cruise ship mishap influenced the New South Wales government in, partly at least following the Victorian government on the school ban.
Yeah, Rebecca, your thoughts on this too? I might just put up a headline here, because we had early last week the 9 media newspapers going with a headline suggesting up to 150,000 people could die. Now, there's a way you can look at the numbers and the epidemiology here and what public figures have said to come up with that, but is that overly alarmist?
Well, look, what I think is important here in the coverage is the tone that people adopt. And I think people want calm, they want people to be considered, they certainly want scrutiny. I think decisions like how on earth those cruise ship passengers were allowed to disembark absolutely deserves a penetrating dissection. At the same time, I'm pleased to see that even in Parliament we're seeing a greater tone of civility, and it's honestly something we've needed for a long time. There's been far too much hyper-partisanship in politics and in the media, and I think what we need to see is absolute rigour, but at the same time a kind of an air of calm and respect that we work through these issues.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we saw a pretty mature approach in Parliament. Labor asked some pointed questions, but they were on the issues, and the government actually tried to answer them. Unusual times, but they got back to some partisan point scoring afterwards, mind you. What are your thoughts, James, on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'd echo what Chris and Rebecca have said here, but the point that the media needs to understand here is that this is the closest thing that any of the people who are covering stories in Canberra or anywhere else in the country right now have ever been to a real existential threat kind of war. I mean, you have, yes, those headlines that say 150,000 people could die. I think that's probably alarmist, but at the same time, this is not the time for point scoring. We're looking at a time now when everything is open for debate. There are new restrictions being made on the way that we live and work and act and interact with one another that are coming down the pike every day. And the media here, I think, if they keep playing the games of gotcha and this and that and the other thing, they're going to do themselves such a big disservice in 10 times the way that they did in the United States over Trump, in terms of not just being distrusted, but they're going to find restrictions come down on them, I think, eventually, if this crisis continues in a more apocalyptic sort of scenario, because they will have shown that they won't be doing the right thing by the Australian people in terms of reporting facts, holding government to account fairly. And I think the cruise ship thing, absolutely correct. And I echo what everyone said about Simon Benson being absolutely correct to suggest that that had something to do with the way events shambolically played out yesterday. But the media needs to also take a hard look at itself and the way that it deals with itself, because it's going to come out of this. Eventually, we're going to come out of this eventually, and whether there's still a respected organ in the society afterward, is going to be determined by their behavior right now.
Well, I just want to get some more thoughts on that from Chris Mitchell in a moment, because this is a critical point. Journalists always want to break the news first. They always want to find out what's happening first. This station trades on that as much as anybody else. Want to find out what Cabinet is going to do, and if you can, tell the public first, you tell them. Now, when that's a sports-wrought story or sudden such scandal, no harm is done. The first you get out there, the better with any snippet. But I wonder whether some of our rush to get stuff out there quickly in this situation is a bit over the top, given how much fluidity there is and given what's at stake. Here's a couple of clips from just yesterday.
What the two major states, New South Wales and Victoria, are pushing for now is to go much further than what the Prime Minister just said then and push for an entire lockdown of all activity that's non-essential. So you can go to the shops, but almost nothing else. We would see happen on the streets of Sydney and on the streets of Melbourne what we're seeing happening around the world, and that they're also going to push for a closure of the schools from Tuesday.
I just think that this is such a bad sign politically, that you've just had the Prime Minister in Canberra making these huge stimulus announcements, and now we're about to see the New South Wales Premier come out with her own major announcement, half an hour or so after the Prime Minister's just held that news conference. It seems like they're not on the same page.
Ash Gillen there and Chris Uhlmann from Nine Media. And Chris Mitchell, there's obviously sources are speaking to journalists and telling them what they think might happen. So journalists are putting it out there. But, of course, some of it doesn't turn out to be true in the end because a national cabinet hasn't met. No wonder the public gets some mixed messages.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. It's interesting that people on the left often talk about trust the science. Well, we've got a chief medical officer, and while there will be debates within the medical community, I don't think it's necessary for journalists to try and find conflict between different medicos who have different views. So it seems to me that the sort of respectful reporting that we saw after 9/11 might be more appropriate when we're talking about a global pandemic than sort of gotcha moments.
Yeah, that's spot on, because, Rebecca, you've written a lot about the history and the medicine here, and the point is you should get no gold star for finding differing opinions. You know there's going to be differing opinions. It's an imperfect science. You have to trust in the end that the chief medical officers, especially when they're meeting not just federally but from around the nation, that they will come to a considered policy option that we all ought to really be prone to support.
Well, I think that's right. Look, I always think that it's better to have a free press, and we wouldn't be in this mess if China weren't a repressive state that allows no difference of opinion and no free press at all. So I tend to always think whatever the mistakes, but accuracy is very important. And as we saw, we had in a press conference on Sunday, we had a journalist saying that the figures when the Hubei lockdown took place, that there were fewer cases than in Australia. Well, cases, yes, but not fatalities, and that's critical. You see, you can have a lot of cases, as South Korea does, and still have a very low fatality rate. And thank goodness so far, Australia has more cases than Hubei had that point, but far fewer fatalities. And of course, that's allowing for the fact that we can have zero confidence that at that point the Chinese were reporting honestly what the cases were. So I think accuracy is critical in reporting these matters.